Believe it or not, this is one of my favorite tellings of the resurrection story. I really love the Gospel of Mark. Remember that it was the very first Gospel. And remember also the way that it would have been heard. There's a reason why it's so short and economical. And I've mentioned this before, I'm pretty sure. This is a gospel that people would have been listening to. In the first century in ancient Rome, it was very common for theater and public performances of philosophers or athletes or whatever to be free. And you could just go in, and so you'd have people that would have an afternoon, and you'd have very, very wealthy people and very, very poor people all together taking in different performances. And this would have been a performance in Rome, and you would have maybe paid a coin, maybe it was free, and you'd go in, and it would take about a couple of hours to go through the whole gospel from beginning to end, and you would have heard the whole gospel story. You have to remember also that this is a kind of story at this time. This story, the story of Jesus, captured the hearts and minds of the people in the way that no other story did, and ended up taking over the Roman Empire. It traveled everywhere. It was copied and copied and copied. They found another copy of it. They're thinking it's one of the earliest copies that they used almost as stuffing for a mummy face. They needed lots of papyrus for that. There were so many copies that these things keep turning up. This captured the imagination of everyone. But this story was very different than the other resurrection stories that we hear. Throughout the gospel, there are allusions to things that are going to happen. Remember, there's one passage in Mark where Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he says that he's going to be killed. And after 3 days, he's going to rise again. And Peter gets so upset by this that he rebukes Jesus. Remember, and then Jesus rebukes him back and says, "Get behind me, Satan." And then a second time, Jesus anticipates that the resurrection is going to happen. And he says, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. It happens again. And then this final time, in the tomb, they hear from the angel, and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, flee the tomb in terror, and they tell no one because they were afraid. And that's the end of the gospel. We don't hear anything else. We don't hear about Jesus encountering Peter again. We don't hear about his visiting the disciples in the upper room. And what's interesting is we know, if you want to be a historian about it, Paul's letters precede this. And Paul talks about Jesus visiting the disciples. 500 disciples, Paul says. And then he says, then Jesus visited James, and then Jesus visited me. And he writes all of this about 10 years before Mark wrote his gospel. He did this on purpose. He told this story this way on purpose. He left out the resurrection appearances. Why would he do that? Because this is not supposed to be like a movie. We all love movies and TV shows, and what always happens is you have the good guy, and he does a bunch of amazing things, and then adversity happens, and then you have the happy ending at the end, and then you go home, and you think, that was a great movie. The gospel isn't supposed to be like that. We're supposed to hear this story, and none of the characters have any idea what's going on, in Mark especially, the entire time. Peter is oblivious to the whole thing. They don't know what the transfiguration means. They don't understand the significance of the Last Supper. They don't understand what's happening with the cross. It's a surprise to them. And then they flee in terror. Mark is intending us to be the apostles in this moment. We're supposed to be the saints. We're the only ones who get it. There's even a powerful moment with Jesus on the cross, and it's in Mark's gospel that he says, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And we, as saints and apostles, we know what's happening in that moment. Perhaps in that moment even more than Jesus. Mark wants us to be saints. And when we hear the end of this story and the apostles flee in terror, we're supposed to leap from our seats and want to go to Galilee. We're the ones who understand. We actually got some of those parables as we were hearing it, about the kingdom of God being like a mustard seed, and all of the disciples had no idea what Jesus was talking about it, but there's something in our hearts where those parables made sense. We become saints. We get it. When we hear the end of this story, we leap from our seats. He says, Jesus is in Galilee. Well, those first hearers of this gospel in Rome says, well, we better get to Galilee. Jesus does not die, but is raised, and is raised now in our midst, in our world. Christ is calling us to be found. There's no ending to the Christian story. We are now a part of the Christian story. We're a part of the resurrection. We're called to go out into the world and seek Jesus, who continues to act and work in the midst, especially in the midst of the poor and the sick, those who are alone, those who are in prison, those who are persecuted and suffering injustice. Jesus is calling us to be found. There is an urgency to this Easter gospel. There's peace also. There's peace in the knowledge that death has been conquered. But Mark is trying to get us off our butts and outside. We're not supposed to go home after hearing the gospel, but out into the world in joy, in anticipation, in celebration, and ready to do the work of the gospel and continue to follow Jesus. Happy Easter to all the saints and apostles in this room, all of us followers of Jesus. Amen.